In the pursuit of truth, clarity is essential. We have stripped away the narrative to show you unfiltered, unedited reality. Witness raw, compelling footage from the front lines of justice, allowing the actual events to speak entirely for themselves.
Stand up!
Officer, what's going on? I'm just having coffee.
Don't move! Don't reach for anything!
I need my cane.
Drop the weapon!
Drop it right now. It's a cane, please.
Get on the ground! Face down now!
The body camera footage tells a story that shocked an entire nation. What started as a routine visit to a local coffee shop on a quiet Tuesday morning turned into a viral nightmare that would cost one police officer his career and award one brave veteran the largest settlement in the city's history. The incident lasted exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds, but the consequences would ripple through the community for years to come. Before we dive into this incredible story, let me know in the comments where you're watching from today. And if you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button because what you're about to see will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice in America. The man at the center of this storm was James Mitchell, a 38-year-old Army veteran who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before an IED explosion changed his life forever. The blast had left him with a prosthetic leg and chronic back pain, but James had rebuilt his life with determination that impressed everyone who met him. He worked as a computer technician, volunteered at the local VA hospital, and lived quietly in a small apartment just 6 blocks from downtown. James had developed a morning routine that helped him manage his pain and start each day on a positive note. Every Tuesday and Thursday, he would walk to Sunrise Coffee, a small family-owned shop that served the best breakfast sandwiches in town. The walk was good exercise for his rehabilitation, and the staff had become like family to him over the past 2 years. They knew his order by heart and always had his table ready by the window where he could watch the morning rush while enjoying his coffee. That Tuesday started like any other. James left his apartment at 7:30, walking slowly but steadily with the assistance of his cane. The morning air was crisp, and he took his time, greeting neighbors and stopping to pet a friendly dog that always waited for him at the corner of 5th Street. By 8:15, he was settling into his usual spot at Sunrise Coffee, laptop open, working on a project for a client while sipping his black coffee and eating his bacon and egg sandwich. Officer Derek Sullivan was patrolling the downtown area when he received a call about suspicious activity near the coffee shop. The caller, whose identity would later become a crucial part of this story, reported seeing a black man with a weapon sitting alone and acting strangely. The description was vague, but Sullivan responded immediately, parking his cruiser outside Sunrise Coffee and scanning the area for any signs of trouble. What happened next would be captured by 3 different cameras: the coffee shop's security system, Officer Sullivan's body camera, and most importantly, the cell phone of Rebecca Torres, a nursing student who was studying at a corner table and had the presence of mind to start recording the moment she sensed something was wrong. Officer Sullivan entered the coffee shop with his hand resting on his service weapon. His eyes immediately locked onto James, who was quietly typing on his laptop, completely unaware that he was about to become the target of an encounter that would change both of their lives forever. Sullivan approached the table with an aggressive posture that made several customers look up from their conversations. Without any greeting or explanation, Sullivan demanded that James stand up and put his hands where he could see them. James looked up, confused and startled. He asked what the problem was, his voice calm but clearly bewildered. Sullivan repeated his command, this time louder, drawing the attention of everyone in the small coffee shop. The morning chatter died to an uncomfortable silence. James slowly closed his laptop and attempted to stand, but his prosthetic leg made quick movements difficult. He reached for his cane, which was leaning against the wall next to his chair. The moment James's hand moved toward the cane, Officer Sullivan's demeanor changed completely. He shouted for James to get his hands away from the weapon, drawing his own gun and pointing it directly at the confused veteran. The coffee shop erupted in gasps and screams. Customers dove behind tables and counters. The elderly owner, Maria Santos, who had been wiping down tables nearby, froze in terror. James raised his hands immediately, his cane clattering to the floor, and tried to explain that it was just a walking aid. But Officer Sullivan was no longer listening to reason. Have you ever witnessed something like this unfold in person? Type yes in the comments if you have, because what happened next shows how quickly a situation can spiral completely out of control. Sullivan ordered James to lie face down on the floor. For anyone, this would be a humiliating command. For a disabled veteran with a prosthetic leg and chronic back pain, it was not only humiliating but physically agonizing. James tried to explain his condition, pointing to his leg and asking if he could please remain standing or at least sit in a chair. Sullivan interpreted this as non-compliance and called for backup. Within minutes, 2 more officers arrived at the scene. Officers Linda Rodriguez and Kevin Park entered the coffee shop to find their colleague holding a disabled veteran at gunpoint, while terrified customers huddled behind furniture. The situation should have been de-escalated immediately, but instead, it was about to get much worse. James, still standing with his hands raised, tried to explain to the new officers that there had been some kind of misunderstanding. He spoke slowly and clearly, identifying himself by name and explaining that he was a veteran, having breakfast at his usual table. He offered to show them his military ID, which was in his wallet. Officer Rodriguez seemed to recognize that something wasn't right about the situation, but Officer Park immediately sided with Sullivan. The 3 officers surrounded James, treating him like a dangerous criminal despite the obvious evidence that he posed no threat to anyone. His laptop was still open on the table, displaying a spreadsheet for his work project. His breakfast was half-eaten. His coffee was still warm. Everything about the scene suggested a man who had been peacefully going about his morning routine until he was inexplicably targeted by law enforcement. Rebecca Torres, the nursing student, continued recording from her corner table. Her video would later become the key piece of evidence that exposed the truth about what really happened that morning. She captured every word, every command, every moment of what was clearly an excessive use of police authority against an innocent man. Officer Sullivan demanded to search James's belongings. When James asked why he was being searched, Sullivan claimed he matched the description of a suspect in a recent crime. James asked what crime and what description, but Sullivan refused to provide specifics. This should have been a red flag for the other officers, but they remained silent, allowing their colleague to continue his harassment. The search of James's belongings revealed nothing suspicious. His laptop contained work files and personal documents. His wallet held his driver's license, military ID, VA medical card, and credit cards. His phone showed text messages with his sister and emails about upcoming medical appointments. There was absolutely nothing that could justify the treatment he was receiving. But Officer Sullivan wasn't finished. He insisted that James was acting suspiciously and demanded to know why he was in the coffee shop. James explained, for the 3rd time, that he came here twice a week as part of his routine. The staff confirmed this, with Maria Santos bravely speaking up to tell the officers that James was a regular customer who had never caused any problems. Sullivan then made a decision that would prove to be the most costly mistake of his career. Instead of apologizing and leaving, he decided to arrest James for disorderly conduct and resisting arrest. The charges were completely fabricated, but Sullivan seemed determined to justify his initial aggressive response rather than admit he had made an error. James was handcuffed and led out of the coffee shop while customers watched in shock and disbelief. Rebecca Torres followed, still recording, capturing the moment when James was placed in the back of a police cruiser despite having committed no crime whatsoever. The entire incident had lasted less than 15 minutes, but the consequences would unfold over the next 2 years. What none of the officers knew was that their actions were being watched by more than just the people in the coffee shop. The incident occurred directly across the street from the offices of Johnson and Associates, a civil rights law firm known for taking on cases of police misconduct. Attorney David Johnson had been arriving at work when he noticed the commotion and stopped to observe what was happening. Johnson recognized immediately that he was witnessing a clear case of racial profiling and excessive force. He took note of the officers' badge numbers and the time of the incident. By the time James was driven away in the police cruiser, Johnson was already making phone calls to colleagues and preparing to take action. The arrest report filed by Officer Sullivan that morning would later become a crucial piece of evidence in the lawsuit that followed. Sullivan claimed that James had been acting suspiciously, refused to comply with lawful orders, and attempted to reach for what appeared to be a weapon. Every single statement in the report was contradicted by the video evidence that Rebecca Torres had captured. James spent 6 hours in jail before being released on his own recognizance. The charges against him were dropped 3 days later when the district attorney's office reviewed the case and determined there was insufficient evidence to proceed. But the damage had already been done. James had been humiliated, traumatized, and branded as a criminal in the community where he had tried to rebuild his life after his military service. The story might have ended there, with James quietly moving on and trying to forget about the incident. Many victims of police misconduct choose this path, unwilling to relive their trauma through a lengthy legal battle. But James was not going to let this injustice stand unchallenged. Challenged. 3 days after his release, James received a phone call that would change everything. David Johnson, the civil rights attorney who had witnessed the incident from across the street, had been trying to track him down. Johnson explained that he had seen what happened and believed James had a strong case for civil rights violations and police misconduct. More importantly, he had evidence that could prove James's innocence and expose the truth about what really occurred that morning. James was hesitant at first. He had spent years trying to avoid conflict and simply wanted to move forward with his life. The last thing he wanted was to become the center of a public controversy or media circus. But Johnson explained that this wasn't just about seeking compensation for what James had endured. It was about preventing the same thing from happening to other innocent people in their community. The investigation began immediately. Johnson's team requested all available footage from the coffee shop's security cameras, Officer Sullivan's body camera, and any other surveillance in the area. They also tracked down Rebecca Torres, whose cell phone video would prove to be the most damning evidence of all. Rebecca had captured the entire incident from beginning to end, and her footage clearly showed that James had done nothing to warrant the aggressive response he received. But the most shocking discovery came when Johnson's team dug deeper into the anonymous call that had triggered the incident in the first place. The caller had reported a suspicious black man with a weapon, but when investigators analyzed the phone records, they found something disturbing. The call had come from Patricia Wilson, a local resident with a history of making false reports about black men in the neighborhood. Wilson had called the police 7 times in the previous 18 months, always reporting suspicious activity involving black men who were later found to be doing nothing wrong. She had reported a black jogger as a potential burglar, a black delivery driver as someone casing houses, and a black teenager walking to school as a gang member. Each time, police had responded and found no evidence of criminal activity. The pattern was clear, but it had been ignored by the police department. No one had connected the dots or flagged Wilson as someone who might be abusing the emergency system to harass innocent people. Her call about James was just the latest in a series of racially motivated false reports that should have been investigated months earlier. When Johnson's team interviewed Wilson, she initially denied making the call, but when confronted with phone records, she changed her story. She claimed she had genuinely believed James looked suspicious because he was sitting alone with a laptop and seemed to be watching people. When pressed about why this behavior was suspicious, she couldn't provide a coherent answer. The depositions revealed even more disturbing information. Wilson admitted under oath that she had been keeping a notebook documenting the activities of black residents in the neighborhood. She had recorded license plate numbers, photographed people walking their dogs, and maintained detailed logs of when people came and went from their homes. Her behavior was classic stalking, but she believed she was protecting her community. Officer Sullivan's deposition was equally revealing. When asked why he had drawn his weapon on James, he claimed the cane looked like a potential weapon. When shown the video footage that clearly revealed it was obviously a walking cane, Sullivan struggled to explain his reaction. His lawyer tried to argue that split-second decisions in law enforcement were difficult, but the video showed that Sullivan had plenty of time to assess the situation properly. The most damaging testimony came when Johnson's team questioned Sullivan about his training in dealing with disabled individuals. Sullivan admitted he had received no specialized training on interacting with people who had mobility aids or prosthetic limbs. He also admitted that he had not asked James about his disability or attempted to accommodate his needs during the arrest. Sullivan's personnel file painted a picture of an officer with a pattern of aggressive behavior, particularly toward minority citizens. He had received 3 formal complaints in the previous 2 years, all from black residents who claimed he had treated them disrespectfully during routine encounters. Each complaint had been dismissed by his supervisors with minimal investigation. The department's Internal Affairs Division had never connected these complaints or looked for patterns in Sullivan's behavior. They treated each incident as isolated rather than recognizing the clear trend of discriminatory conduct. This failure of oversight would become a central part of the lawsuit against the city. As the legal case progressed, more witnesses came forward. Other customers from the coffee shop that morning provided statements describing Sullivan's aggressive demeanor and inappropriate use of force. Maria Santos, the coffee shop owner, testified about how Sullivan had ignored her attempts to vouch for James as a regular customer who had never caused problems. The medical evidence was particularly compelling. James's doctors testified about the physical pain he endured from being forced to stand with his hands raised for an extended period. His prosthetic leg was not designed for prolonged standing without support, and the stress of the situation had aggravated his chronic back condition. He required additional physical therapy and pain management treatment following the incident. The psychological impact was even more severe. James had served his country with honor, surviving combat and recovering from devastating injuries with remarkable resilience. But this encounter with police in his own neighborhood had shattered his sense of safety and belonging. He developed anxiety about leaving his apartment, stopped going to his beloved coffee shop, and required counseling to deal with the trauma. Dr. Sarah Kim, a psychologist specializing in trauma treatment for veterans, evaluated James and found that the incident had triggered symptoms similar to those experienced by combat veterans with PTSD. The irony was heartbreaking. A man who had survived roadside bombs and enemy fire in Afghanistan was traumatized by his own police force in a small coffee shop where he had felt safe and welcomed. The city's legal team tried to minimize the incident, arguing that Sullivan had responded appropriately to a report of suspicious activity. They claimed that James's failure to immediately comply with orders had escalated the situation unnecessarily. But this argument crumbled when confronted with the video evidence showing James attempting to explain his disability and asking for accommodation. The defense also tried to portray Wilson's call as a good faith report from a concerned citizen. But Johnson's team presented evidence of her pattern of false reports and her admitted surveillance activities targeting black residents. The jury would ultimately see Wilson not as a concerned neighbor, but as someone whose racial bias had weaponized the police against an innocent veteran. Public opinion began to shift as details of the case became known. Local veterans organizations rallied behind James, expressing outrage that a decorated combat veteran had been treated so poorly by the very community he had sworn to protect. The American Legion and Veterans of Foreign Wars issued joint statements condemning the incident and calling for accountability. Civil rights groups also mobilized, organizing peaceful protests outside the police station and City Hall. They demanded not just justice for James, but systemic changes to prevent similar incidents in the future. The protests were well organized and peaceful, but they kept pressure on city officials who were hoping the controversy would fade away quietly. Media coverage intensified when Rebecca Torres decided to release her full video publicly. She had initially provided it only to James's legal team, but as the city tried to downplay the incident, she felt compelled to let the community see exactly what had happened. The video went viral within hours of being posted online, generating national attention and outrage. News outlets across the country picked up the story, often leading with headlines about a disabled veteran being held at gunpoint while having coffee. The optics were devastating for the police department and city officials. Editorial writers and television commentators struggled to find any justification for Sullivan's actions. The police union initially defended Sullivan, claiming he had followed proper procedures and suggesting that the incident was being blown out of proportion by activists looking for a cause. But as more evidence emerged, even some union leaders began to distance themselves from Sullivan's actions. The video footage was simply too clear to dispute. Internal pressure within the police department grew as officers who had worked with Sullivan came forward with their own concerns about his behavior. Several colleagues admitted privately that they had witnessed Sullivan making inappropriate comments about minority citizens, but had not reported them through official channels. The code of silence that often protects problematic officers began to crack. Chief of Police Michael Roberts found himself in an impossible position. He had initially supported Sullivan publicly, but the mounting evidence made that stance untenable. Roberts faced calls for his own resignation from community leaders who argued that his failure to address Sullivan's previous complaints showed poor judgment and inadequate leadership. The investigation revealed systemic problems beyond just Sullivan's individual misconduct. The police department lacked adequate training on disability awareness, had no clear protocols for dealing with false reports, and maintained a complaint system that discouraged accountability. These institutional failures had created an environment where Sullivan's behavior could flourish unchecked. As the lawsuit moved toward trial, settlement negotiations began in earnest. The city's insurance company recognized that the case was virtually unwinnable and pushed for a resolution that would avoid the uncertainty and additional publicity of a trial. James's legal team was prepared to go to court, but they also understood the value of reaching an agreement that could provide immediate relief and guarantee systemic changes. The negotiations were complex, involving not just monetary compensation, but also requirements for policy changes, additional training, and oversight measures. James and his attorneys wanted to ensure that their settlement would prevent future incidents like his from occurring. They demanded accountability not just for Sullivan, but for the supervisors who had failed to recognize and address his problematic behavior. What do you think would be a fair resolution to this case? The answer would ultimately surprise everyone involved and set a new standard for police accountability in their community. The settlement talks stretched on for 8 weeks, with both sides digging in on key issues. James's legal team demanded $1.2 million in damages, a figure that reflected not just his pain and suffering, but the broader message that needed to be sent about accountability. The city initially offered $300,000, an amount that Johnson immediately rejected as insulting to his client and inadequate given the severity of the misconduct. Behind closed doors, the real negotiations centered on the non-monetary aspects of the settlement. James wanted guarantees that Officer Sullivan would be fired and never work in law enforcement again. He wanted mandatory training for all officers on disability awareness and de-escalation techniques. Most importantly, he wanted a citizen oversight board with real power to investigate complaints and discipline officers who violated department policies. The city resisted these demands, arguing that personnel decisions were internal matters and that additional oversight would interfere with police operations. But their position weakened with each passing day as more details emerged about the department's failures. Local newspapers began running investigative series about other questionable incidents involving Sullivan and his colleagues. A breakthrough came when the state attorney general's office announced it was launching its own investigation into the police department's practices. The threat of federal intervention made city officials more willing to negotiate seriously. They realized that a settlement with James might be their best chance to control the narrative and implement reforms on their own terms, rather than having changes imposed by outside authorities. The final settlement agreement was reached on a Friday afternoon in early November, almost exactly 1 year after the incident at the coffee shop. The terms were more comprehensive than anyone had initially expected. James would receive $1.2 million, making it the largest police misconduct settlement in the city's history. But the money was only part of the story. Officer Sullivan was terminated immediately and agreed never to seek employment in law enforcement anywhere in the state. His pension was reduced, and he was required to pay a portion of the settlement from his own resources. The agreement also barred him from carrying firearms professionally and required him to complete anger management and racial bias counseling at his own expense. The department agreed to implement sweeping reforms that would fundamentally change how officers were trained and supervised. Every officer would receive 40 hours of additional training on disability awareness, cultural sensitivity, and de-escalation techniques. Body cameras would be mandatory for all interactions with the public, with severe penalties for officers who failed to activate them or who tampered with footage. A civilian review board was established with the power to investigate complaints, subpoena evidence, and recommend disciplinary action. The board would include representatives from disability rights organizations, civil rights groups, and the veteran community. Most importantly, the board would have access to all department records and the authority to publish annual reports on police conduct. The false reporting problem was addressed through new protocols requiring officers to verify suspicious activity reports before taking aggressive action. Dispatchers would be trained to ask specific questions about reported incidents, and repeat callers would be flagged for possible counseling or legal action. The woman who had made the false report about James faced her own consequences, including a restraining order preventing her from calling police about her neighbors without clear evidence of actual criminal activity. Chief Roberts announced his retirement 2 weeks after the settlement was finalized. His departure was officially voluntary, but everyone understood that his position had become untenable. The new chief would be hired through a national search process with input from community organizations, marking a significant change in how the department selected its leadership. The coffee shop where the incident occurred became an unlikely symbol of the community's healing process. Maria Santos worked with local artists to create a mural celebrating diversity and veteran service. The wall where James had sat that morning now featured images of military personnel from different backgrounds alongside quotes about justice and equality. The memorial drew visitors from across the region and became a popular spot for peaceful gatherings and community events. James used a portion of his settlement to establish a foundation, providing legal assistance to other veterans who faced discrimination or civil rights violations. The foundation partnered with law schools to create a clinic where students could gain experience handling civil rights cases under the supervision of experienced attorneys. Within 2 years, the clinic had taken on over 60 cases and recovered substantial settlements for veterans who had been wronged by various institutions. The psychological healing proved more challenging than the legal victory. James continued therapy for months after the settlement, working through the complex emotions that came with his public vindication. He felt grateful for the support he had received, but also burdened by the responsibility of representing other victims of police misconduct. The attention from media and advocacy groups was sometimes overwhelming for someone who preferred privacy and quiet routines. Slowly, James began to reclaim his life and his community. He started visiting different coffee shops around the city, gradually building confidence to be in public spaces again. The staff at these establishments often recognized him and went out of their way to make him feel welcome. Some offered free meals or coffee, gestures he appreciated even when he politely declined them. The case attracted attention from legal scholars and police reform advocates nationwide. Law schools began using the incident as a teaching tool in courses on civil rights and constitutional law. Police academies incorporated the video footage into training programs, showing recruits how quickly situations could escalate when officers made assumptions based on racial bias rather than actual evidence of wrongdoing. Officer Rodriguez and Officer Park, who had arrived as backup during the incident, faced their own consequences for failing to intervene when they witnessed Sullivan's inappropriate conduct. Both were suspended for 2 weeks without pay and required to complete additional training on their duty to prevent misconduct by colleagues. Their personnel files would permanently reflect their failure to act when they should have protected an innocent citizen. The ripple effects extended beyond law enforcement. Emergency dispatch centers across the state implemented new protocols for handling suspicious person reports, requiring callers to provide specific details about observed criminal behavior rather than vague descriptions of people who seemed out of place. Training programs were developed to help dispatchers identify potentially biased or false reports before officers were sent to investigate. Rebecca Torres, whose quick thinking to record the incident had provided crucial evidence, became an advocate for bystander intervention and documentation of police encounters, She spoke at community forums about the importance of citizens witnessing and recording interactions between law enforcement and community members. Her nursing school classmates organized workshops teaching people how to safely document incidents while avoiding interference with police operations. The legal precedent established by James's case influenced other lawsuits around the country. Attorneys representing victims of police misconduct began citing the settlement as evidence that courts and juries were willing to impose significant financial consequences for civil rights violations. The case demonstrated that comprehensive reforms could be achieved through litigation when political processes failed to address systemic problems. Media coverage of the settlement sparked broader conversations about the treatment of disabled individuals by law enforcement. Disability rights organizations used the attention to push for federal legislation requiring specialized training for officers who might encounter people with mobility aids, prosthetic devices, or other assistive equipment. Several states passed laws specifically protecting people with disabilities from discrimination during police encounters. The financial impact on the city was substantial but manageable. Insurance covered most of the settlement amount, though premiums increased significantly for the following years. City council members faced tough questions from taxpayers about why the incident had been allowed to happen and what steps were being taken to prevent similar costly mistakes in the future. Some residents complained that the settlement was excessive and would encourage frivolous lawsuits against police officers who were just trying to do their jobs. But these voices were largely drowned out by community members who recognized that the payment reflected the severity of the violation and the need for meaningful change. Public opinion polls showed majority support for the reforms that were implemented as part of the agreement. The coffee shop experienced an unexpected boost in business as people made pilgrimages to see where the incident occurred and to show support for the establishment that had stood by James during his ordeal. Maria Santos used the increased revenue to hire additional employees and expand the shop's community outreach programs. She established a scholarship fund for local veterans pursuing education or job training. Training companies that specialized in police reform saw increased demand for their services as departments across the region sought to avoid similar incidents. The curriculum developed for James's settlement became a model that was adapted and implemented in dozens of other jurisdictions. Videos of proper de-escalation techniques and disability awareness were distributed to police departments nationwide. James eventually returned to Sunrise Coffee, though not immediately and not without careful preparation. His first visit back, 6 months after the settlement, was arranged privately with Maria Santos. He sat at a different table than his usual spot, accompanied by his counselor and David Johnson. The experience was emotional but ultimately healing, representing a reclamation of the space where his ordeal had begun. The incident continued to influence James's daily life in both positive and challenging ways. He received letters from veterans around the country, sharing their own stories of discrimination and thanking him for his courage in fighting back. These connections helped him understand that his experience, while traumatic, had created opportunities to help others who faced similar challenges. Do you think the reforms that came from this case will actually prevent future incidents, or will they just make departments more careful about how they handle misconduct? The answer would depend largely on how seriously the community continued to monitor and enforce the changes that had been so hard-fought and expensively won. The answer would become clear over the following months as the reforms were tested by real-world situations. The first major test came just 8 weeks after the settlement when officers responded to another suspicious person call involving a black man with what appeared to be a weapon. This time, however, the response was dramatically different. Officer Jennifer Walsh received the call and immediately implemented the new protocols. Instead of rushing to the scene with assumptions, she asked the dispatcher specific questions about what the caller had actually observed. The caller admitted they hadn't seen any threatening behavior, just a man sitting on a bench holding something in his hands. Walsh approached the situation with caution, but without the aggressive posture that had characterized Sullivan's response. The man turned out to be a local artist, sketching buildings for a community mural project. His pencils and drawing pad had been mistaken for something sinister by a passerby who hadn't bothered to look closely before calling police. Walsh engaged in friendly conversation, admired his artwork, and even asked about commissioning a piece for the police station lobby. The entire interaction lasted 5 minutes and ended with handshakes and mutual respect. The contrast was striking and deliberate. The department released Walsh's body camera footage as an example of how the new training and protocols were supposed to work. Community leaders praised the professional handling of what could have become another traumatic encounter. The incident demonstrated that change was possible when officers approached situations with open minds rather than predetermined biases. However, not every test of the reforms was successful. 3 months later, an officer named Robert Hayes was caught on surveillance camera using excessive force during a traffic stop involving a Latino driver. The Citizen Review Board investigated immediately and recommended termination within 2 weeks. Hayes was fired and faced criminal charges for assault, showing that the new oversight system had real teeth when officers violated policy. James Mitchell's story proves that justice isn't always swift, but it can still arrive when brave people refuse to stay silent. One man's courage to fight back transformed an entire community's approach to policing and civil rights. Sometimes, the most ordinary moments become the catalyst for extraordinary change. This case was brutal, but the case on the right spirals completely out of control.
In the pursuit of truth, clarity is essential. We have stripped away the narrative to show you unfiltered, unedited reality. Witness raw, compelling footage from the front lines of justice, allowing the actual events to speak entirely for themselves.